The fluorescent lights in the Riverside Community Center's meeting room buzzed overhead as I stood frozen by the coffee station, my hand trembling around a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. The familiar aroma of burned coffee and industrial disinfectant that usually comforted me during our weekly grief support group now made my stomach churn. What I'd just overheard in the hallway outside had shattered my world in a matter of seconds. "Poor Dorothy," I'd heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to another woman. "Can you imagine having a daughter-in-law who stressed your son so badly that she gave him a heart attack? Helen Morgan told me all about it at the grocery store yesterday. That woman worked him to death with her constant demands and arguments. Before I share this shocking experience, please show your support with a like and subscribe. Comment your location below. This story gets more unbelievable by the minute, and I need to know you're with me through this journey." My name is Helen Morgan. I'm 60 years old, and I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. My beloved husband David had suffered a massive heart attack 6 months ago while mowing our front lawn on a Saturday morning. The doctors said it was genetic, inevitable given his family history and high cholesterol. But apparently, my mother-in-law, Dorothy Kellerman, had been spinning a completely different story around town. The meeting room's beige walls seemed to close in around me as I tried to process this betrayal. The motivational posters about healing and moving forward felt like cruel jokes now. Through the tall windows, I could see the autumn leaves swirling in the parking lot, golden and brown against the gray October sky. Everything looked the same, but my entire world had just shifted. "Mom, you look like you've seen a ghost," my daughter Sarah Morgan said, approaching me with concern etched across her face. At 35, she had David's kind eyes and my stubborn chin. She'd been my rock through these awful months, driving the 40 minutes from downtown every Tuesday to attend these support group meetings with me. Her navy blazer was wrinkled from her long day at the accounting firm, and she carried the scent of vanilla perfume mixed with coffee. "Sarah, we need to talk," I managed to whisper, setting down my cup with shaking hands. The coffee sloshed, leaving brown stains on the white plastic table. "What's wrong?" Sarah moved closer, her voice dropping to match mine. "You look absolutely pale." Before I could respond, my friend Margaret Chen appeared beside us, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the humid evening air. Margaret had been my closest friend for 20 years, ever since we'd met at the library book club. She'd lost her husband 2 years ago and had been the one to convince me to try this support group. "Ladies, the meeting's about to start," Margaret said gently, then noticed my expression. "Helen, honey, what's happened? You look devastated." The circle of folding chairs in the center of the room began filling with familiar faces, people who'd become like family over these past few months of shared grief. But I couldn't focus on anything except the horrible words echoing in my head. Dorothy had been telling people I'd caused David's death. My own mother-in-law, the woman I'd bent over backward to care for, had been destroying my reputation throughout our small town of Cedar Falls. "I can't stay for the meeting," I told them both, my voice barely audible over the scraping of chairs and quiet conversations around us. "I just learned something that changes everything." Sarah immediately grabbed her purse and car keys. "Then let's go. Margaret, can you cover for us with Dr. Peterson?" Margaret nodded without hesitation. "Of course. Helen, whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. You know that, right?" As we walked through the community center's long hallway, our footsteps echoed off the polished linoleum floors. The walls were lined with local artwork and community announcements, the same cheerful displays I'd walked past every week. But tonight, everything felt different. Tonight, I wondered how many of these people had heard Dorothy's lies about me. The evening air hit my face as we stepped outside, cool and sharp with the promise of winter. Sarah unlocked her silver Honda, and I slumped into the passenger seat while Margaret climbed into the back. The familiar comfort of being surrounded by the two people who loved me most should have helped, but the weight of Dorothy's betrayal pressed down on my chest like a physical thing. "Start from the beginning," Sarah said as she started the engine. The dashboard lights cast a soft blue glow across her worried features. I took a shuddering breath and told them what I'd overheard. With each word, I watched Sarah's face darken and felt Margaret's gentle hand squeeze my shoulder from behind. "That vindictive witch," Sarah muttered, which shocked me because my daughter rarely used harsh language about anyone. "How could she do this to you, after everything you did for Dad, everything you've done for her?" Margaret's voice was steady but furious. "Helen, you know this is complete nonsense. David adored you. Anyone with eyes could see how happy you two were together." But as we sat there in the parking lot, the engine running and the heater beginning to warm the car, I realized this was so much worse than a simple lie. Dorothy had been systematically destroying my reputation while I'd been drowning in grief, unable to defend myself. I thought about all the strange looks I'd received at the pharmacy, the way conversations seemed to stop when I entered the hardware store, how my neighbor had been oddly cold when I'd asked her to collect my mail last week. "We have to do something about this," I said finally, my voice growing stronger. "I can't let her destroy David's memory with these lies, and I can't let her destroy me either." Suddenly, the pieces aligned. Sarah drove us to her apartment, the familiar route through town, feeling surreal in the darkness. I stared out the window at the houses we passed, their warm yellow windows glowing like beacons. Behind each one were families going about their evening routines, probably not dealing with mothers-in-law systematically destroying their reputations. "Mom, you're spiraling," Sarah said gently, glancing at me as we stopped at a red light. "I can practically hear your thoughts racing." She was right. My mind kept jumping from one horrible scenario to another. How many people had Dorothy told? What exactly had she said? The overheard conversation had been devastating enough, but now I was imagining far worse variations of her lies spreading through our small community like poison. Once we were settled in Sarah's cozy living room with cups of tea, Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Helen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Have you noticed anything else strange lately? Any other interactions that felt off?" I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into my palms. "I thought it was just grief making me paranoid. Mrs. Henderson next door has been so distant. And at the grocery store last week, Tom behind the deli counter barely looked at me. He used to always ask about David, chat about the weather. Now he just hands me my order and turns away." Sarah set down her tea with a sharp clink. "Mom, how long do you think she's been doing this?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "I don't know. The funeral was 6 months ago. She could have started then, or—" My voice trailed off as a terrible realization began to form. "What is it?" Margaret asked, noticing my expression. "The hospital," I whispered. When David was in the ICU, Dorothy spent hours in the waiting room. There were always other families there, people from church, neighbors who came to check on him. She had a captive audience of people who cared about David. Margaret's face went pale. "Helen, you don't think she started this while David was still alive?" The possibility made me nauseous. While I had been sitting by my husband's bedside, holding his hand and praying for his recovery, His own mother might have been in the waiting room telling anyone who would listen that I was somehow responsible for his condition. Sarah stood abruptly and began pacing across her small living room. This is unbelievable. Grandma Dorothy has always been controlling, but this is beyond anything I thought she was capable of. What I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, is why. What does she gain from destroying me like this? Margaret, ever the practical one, set down her mug and looked at me directly. Helen, have you considered that this might be about more than just blame? Dorothy lost her son. Some people, when they're grieving, need someone to be the villain in their story. It makes the loss feel less random, less unfair. But David was her only child, I said, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. And now that he's gone, I'm the only connection she has left to him. But instead of bringing us together, she's chosen to make me her enemy. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face us. The question is, what are we going to do about it? We can't just let her continue spreading lies about you. The weight of the situation pressed down on me again. Confronting Dorothy seemed impossible. The woman had never liked me, barely tolerated me during the 32 years I was married to her son. How could I possibly make her stop now? But as I sat there in my daughter's living room, surrounded by the two people who knew me best, something shifted inside me. The grief and shock were still there, but underneath them, a spark of anger was beginning to grow. I need to know exactly what she's been saying, I said finally, and I need to know who she's been saying it to. Margaret nodded slowly. That's smart. We need the full picture before we decide how to handle this. But how do we find that out without making things worse? Sarah asked. Before either of them could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. When I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. It was from Dorothy herself, and the message made everything so much worse than I had imagined. The text message from Dorothy was brief but devastating. We need to talk. Come to my house tomorrow at 2 p.m. Don't bring Sarah. I stared at the phone, my hands trembling slightly as I read the words again. The tone was commanding, almost threatening, and the instruction to leave Sarah behind felt deliberately cruel. What is it? Margaret asked, noticing my expression. I handed her the phone, and she read the message aloud. Sarah immediately moved to look over Margaret's shoulder, her face darkening as she heard her grandmother's words. Don't bring Sarah? Sarah repeated, her voice rising with indignation. What am I, 12 years old? This is about my father, too. I took the phone back, still processing Dorothy's message. The timing felt deliberate, coming right when we were discussing her lies. Had someone told her we were asking questions? Or was this just Dorothy's way of maintaining control over the narrative? She wants to get you alone, Margaret observed, settling back into her chair. Without witnesses, without support, that's not a good sign, Helen. Sarah began pacing again, her movements sharp with frustration. This is exactly what Grandma Dorothy does. She isolates people, makes them feel small and powerless. She did it to Dad sometimes when I was growing up. This was news to me. What do you mean? Sarah paused by the window, looking out at the street but clearly seeing something from the past. When I was in high school, there were times Dad would come home from visiting her looking defeated, like she'd taken all the wind out of his sails. He never told me what they talked about, but I could see how it affected him. The idea that Dorothy had been undermining David even while he was alive added another layer to my growing understanding of her behavior. Margaret must have seen something in my expression because she leaned forward with concern. Helen, you don't have to go. You could call her or suggest meeting somewhere public or insist that Sarah come with you. But if I don't go, or if I change her terms, she'll just see it as confirmation that I have something to hide," I said, thinking through the implications. "And she'll probably use my refusal as more ammunition against me." Sarah turned from the window, her jaw set with determination. "Then I'll go with you anyway. She can't physically stop me from being there." "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "That would just give her more reasons to paint me as disrespectful, as someone who can't follow simple instructions. She'd probably claim I was trying to coach you or manipulate the situation." Margaret frowned. "So what are you thinking?" I stood up and began gathering my thoughts, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Not quite strength, but maybe the beginning of it. "I'm thinking that maybe it's time I heard exactly what Dorothy has to say. All these weeks I've been defending myself against rumors and whispers. Maybe it's time for a direct conversation." "That's incredibly brave of you," Sarah said, though her voice carried worry. "But what if she just uses the opportunity to hurt you more? What if she says things that are even worse than what she's been telling other people?" "Then at least I'll know what I'm dealing with," I replied. "Right now, I'm fighting shadows. I need to understand exactly what she believes happened and why she's so determined to blame me." Margaret set down her mug and studied my face carefully. "You're not planning to just let her attack you, are you? Because confronting her is one thing, but you can't let her destroy you in the process." "I don't know what I'm planning yet," I admitted. "But I know I can't keep living like this. Every time I go to the grocery store, every time I see someone from our old church, I wonder if they're looking at me and thinking I killed my husband. I need this to stop." Sarah came over and sat beside me on the couch. "What if we prepared some responses ahead of time? Like, if she says certain things, you could have answers ready." The suggestion had merit, but I found myself shaking my head. I don't want to go in there with a script. If I'm going to face her, I need to do it honestly, as myself, not as some version of me that we've rehearsed. Margaret looked concerned. "Just promise us that if she becomes abusive, you'll leave. You don't owe her the right to destroy you, Helen. Grief doesn't excuse cruelty." "I promise," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if I'd be able to keep that promise when faced with Dorothy's accusations. Sarah squeezed my hand. "I hate that you have to do this alone." "I won't be alone," I said, looking between my daughter and my friend. "I'll carry both of you with me. Everything you've said tonight, all the support you've given me, it changes how I see myself. Dorothy might not see it, but I'm not the same broken woman who's been hiding from the world these past months." We spent another hour talking through possibilities, trying to anticipate what Dorothy might say and how I might respond. But as the evening wore on, I realized that no amount of preparation could ready me for tomorrow's confrontation. When I finally left Sarah's house, Margaret walked me to my car. "Call me the moment you leave her house," she said. "I don't care what time it is." "I will," I promised. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I found myself thinking about David and wondering what he would want me to do. Would he want me to defend myself against his mother's accusations? Would he want me to preserve the peace at any cost? Or would he want me to find some way to heal this terrible rift that his death had created? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision about tomorrow's meeting with Dorothy. It wasn't the decision I thought I would make, and it certainly wasn't the safe choice. But it was the only choice that felt true to who I was becoming in the wake of losing David. The next day, at 1:45 p.m., I sat in my car outside Dorothy's house gathering my courage. I had no idea that in 15 minutes, Dorothy would make an accusation so shocking that it would change everything I thought I knew about my husband's death. I took 3 deep breaths before walking up Dorothy's front path. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but maybe that was because I felt different approaching it this time. Instead of the scared, guilt-ridden woman who had been avoiding confrontation for months, I was someone who had finally decided to stand up for herself. Dorothy answered the door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching from the window. She looked older than when I'd seen her at the funeral 6 months ago, her gray hair thinner and her face more drawn. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Helen," she said finally, her voice flat and cold. "Hello, Dorothy. Thank you for agreeing to see me." She stepped back to let me in, but her posture remained rigid. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." The living room felt suffocating with its heavy drapes drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Dorothy gestured toward the couch where David and I used to sit during our Sunday visits, but I remained standing. I needed to feel grounded for this conversation. "Dorothy, I came here because I need to address what's been happening since David died," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I know you've been telling people that I caused his heart attack." Her chin lifted defiantly. "I've been telling people the truth as I see it." "Then tell me what truth that is, because I genuinely don't understand what you think I did wrong." Dorothy moved to her armchair, the one she'd always claimed as hers during family gatherings. "You know exactly what you did. All those years of stress you put him under, making him choose between his family and you, never letting him visit me as much as he wanted to." I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Dorothy, David visited you every other Sunday for our entire marriage. He called you twice a week. How was I preventing that?" "You always had some excuse why he couldn't stay longer. Some dinner you'd planned, or some friend coming over. You controlled his schedule." "We had a life together." "Yes, sometimes we had other commitments, but David never complained about not seeing you enough. In fact, he sometimes asked if we could skip visits when he was tired from work." Dorothy's eyes flashed with anger. "That's a lie. David would never have said that. He was devoted to me until you turned him against his own mother." I sat down then, realizing this conversation was going to be longer and more difficult than I'd anticipated. "Dorothy, I never tried to turn David against you. I encouraged him to maintain your relationship even when what?" I hesitated, knowing I was about to cross a line we'd never crossed before. "Even when you criticized everything about our marriage, our house, my cooking, the way I dressed, how we spent our money. David used to come home from visits here feeling terrible because you'd spent 2 hours telling him everything I was doing wrong." Dorothy's face went white, then red. "I was trying to help him see that you weren't the right woman for him. I was his mother. It was my job to protect him." "From what? From being happy?" "Because he was happy, Dorothy. We had a good marriage." "Good?" She laughed bitterly. "You call constant arguing good? You call making him work overtime to pay for your expensive tastes good? You call forcing him to take medication that weakened his heart good?" I stared at her. "What are you talking about? What constant arguing? What expensive tastes? And what medication?" "Don't pretend you don't know. David told me everything. How you fought about money all the time because you wanted things he couldn't afford. How you made him take those blood pressure pills even though he didn't want to." My head was spinning. "Dorothy, we rarely fought about money. We were comfortable. And David's doctor prescribed those blood pressure medications. I didn't make him take anything. I encouraged him to follow his doctor's orders because I wanted him to stay healthy. His doctor? Dorothy's voice dripped with contempt. That doctor you made him switch to because you didn't like Dr. Peterson, who'd been treating our family for 20 years. Dr. Peterson retired, Dorothy. That's why David switched doctors. And his new doctor said his blood pressure was dangerously high. The medication was supposed to protect his heart. Dorothy stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. You're twisting everything, just like you always did. Making yourself sound innocent when you were slowly killing my son. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Dorothy, you can't possibly believe that I wanted anything but the best for David. I loved him more than my own life. She whirled around to face me. Love? You call nagging a man to death love? You call forcing him to take pills that made him weak love? I didn't nag him, and those pills were supposed to prevent exactly what happened to him. Were they? Dorothy's eyes were wild now. Or did they cause it? Because I've been reading about those medications, Helen. I've been doing research. And do you know what I found? A cold dread was settling in my stomach, but I forced myself to ask. What did you find? I found out that sometimes those blood pressure medications can cause heart problems in certain people. I found out that David might still be alive today if you hadn't forced him to take pills he didn't need. I felt like the room was tilting. Dorothy, that's not... His doctor said he needed them. His blood pressure was 180 over 110. That's stroke territory. According to a doctor who barely knew him, Dr. Peterson never said David needed any pills. Dr. Peterson said he was fine for 20 years. Because Dr. Peterson was old school and didn't believe in preventive care. David's new doctor ran actual tests, current tests, the kind that save lives. Dorothy moved closer to me, her voice dropping to an intense whisper. Then why is my son dead, Helen? If those pills were supposed to save his life, why did his heart stop at 52 years old? I stood up, my hands shaking. Because sometimes medicine can't prevent everything, because heart disease runs in your family. Because David was under stress at work and hadn't been sleeping well, and because his wife spent 5 years slowly poisoning him with medications he didn't need while making his home life so miserable that his heart couldn't take it anymore. The room fell silent except for the sound of both of us breathing heavily. I stared at Dorothy, finally understanding the depth of her delusion, the complete narrative she'd constructed to make sense of losing her son. Dorothy, I said quietly, David died of a massive heart attack brought on by coronary artery disease. The autopsy showed that his arteries were severely blocked. The medications weren't hurting him. If anything, they probably gave us more time together than we would have had otherwise. Autopsy. Dorothy practically spat the word. Another thing you forced on him. David wouldn't have wanted his body cut open like that. The autopsy was required by law because he died suddenly without a clear cause. I didn't choose it, and I certainly didn't want it, but it gave us answers about what really happened. Dorothy sat back down heavily. The only answer I need is that my son is dead, and he died because the woman who promised to love and protect him failed him in every possible way. I looked at this woman who had been part of my life for 15 years, who had raised the man I'd loved more than anything, and I realized that no amount of truth or logic was going to change her mind. She needed me to be the villain in this story because the alternative, that David's death was random and unavoidable, was too painful for her to accept. But as I stood there looking at Dorothy's grief-ravaged face, I realized something else. Something that made my blood run cold and changed everything I thought I knew about the months leading up to David's death. Dorothy, I said slowly. When did David tell you that we were fighting about money? Her eyes flickered. What do you mean? You said David told you we fought about money all the time. When did he tell you that? Because we never fought about money, so I'm wondering when these conversations happened. Dorothy's hands started fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. He called me sometimes, when he was upset. What times did he call? I don't remember specific times. Morning? Evening? Weekends? Sometimes during the day, when you weren't home. A horrible suspicion was forming in my mind. Dorothy, was David calling you from work? During his lunch breaks? She didn't answer, but her face told me everything I needed to know. Oh my God, I whispered. You were the one calling him, weren't you? You were calling David at work and telling him that I was trying to control him, that the medications were dangerous, that he should stop taking them. Dorothy's silence was confirmation enough, but what she said next made me sink back onto the couch in shock. Someone had to tell him the truth about what you were doing to him, she said defiantly. Someone had to make him see that his wife was more interested in playing doctor than trusting that he knew his own body. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at Dorothy, feeling the room spin around me as the full implications of what she just admitted began to sink in. The living room suddenly felt suffocating, the floral wallpaper seeming to close in on me, and I had to grip the arm of the couch to steady myself. You called him at work, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. You called David at his office and convinced him to stop taking his heart medication. Dorothy's chin lifted in defiance, but I could see the guilt flickering in her eyes. I told him to listen to his body, to not let you control every aspect of his life. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture so devastating I could barely comprehend it. Those last few months, when David had seemed distant, when he'd started skipping doses and making excuses about the pills, making him feel worse. I'd thought it was just his natural resistance to being on medication long term. I'd never imagined that his own mother was systematically undermining his treatment. How often? I asked, my voice growing stronger with each word. How often did you call him to poison him against the very medications that were keeping him alive? I wasn't poisoning him, Dorothy snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. I was trying to save him from a wife who was more concerned with controlling him than loving him. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Dorothy's meticulously maintained garden. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn, and I found myself thinking about how much effort Dorothy put into controlling every blade of grass, every flower bed, just like she'd tried to control David. Do you have any idea what you've done? I turned back to face her, and I could feel tears starting to burn behind my eyes. David trusted you. When his own mother called him and told him the medications were dangerous, when you told him I was trying to control him, he believed you. And now he's dead. Dorothy's face crumpled slightly, but she quickly composed herself. The doctors said he had a weak heart, that it could have happened anyway. Could have, I repeated, feeling something break open inside me. Could have, but we'll never know, will we? Because you convinced him to stop taking the medications that were specifically prescribed to prevent exactly what happened to him. I sank back down onto the couch, suddenly feeling exhausted. The grief I'd been carrying for the past 8 months felt different now, heavier and more complicated. I'd been mourning David and dealing with the guilt that maybe I could have done something different, something more. But I'd never imagined that someone else, someone who claimed to love him, had been actively working against his health. "I need to know everything," I said quietly. "Every conversation you had with him, every time you told him not to trust me or the doctors. I need to know it all." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "It started about 6 months before he died. You'd mentioned at Sunday dinner that you were making sure he took his pills every morning, and it reminded me of how my mother used to hover over my father, always checking on him, always treating him like he couldn't take care of himself. So you decided to interfere with his medical care based on something that reminded you of your parents?" "I called him the next week," Dorothy continued, ignoring my question, "just to check in. And when I mentioned that you seemed very concerned about his medication, he said he'd been feeling tired lately and wondered if the pills were making it worse. So I told him that maybe he should listen to his body instead of just following orders." I felt sick to my stomach. "What else?" "Over the next few months, I'd call him maybe once a week during his lunch break. We'd talk about normal things, but I'd always ask how he was feeling. And when he mentioned being tired or having any kind of side effect, I'd suggest that maybe the medications were doing more harm than good." The room felt like it was closing in on me. I thought about all those times David had come home from work, seeming distracted or troubled. All those evenings when he'd been quiet during dinner, when I'd assumed he was just stressed about work. He'd been carrying the weight of his mother's constant undermining of his treatment, and I'd been completely oblivious. "Did you ever tell him to stop taking the medications entirely?" I asked. Dorothy hesitated. "Not exactly, but I may have mentioned that maybe he should try going without them for a few days, just to see how he felt." "Oh, God," I whispered. "Dorothy, do you realize what you did? Do you understand that David died because his heart medication wasn't at therapeutic levels when he had his attack?" For the first time since I'd arrived, Dorothy looked genuinely shaken. "The doctors never said that. They said he had a heart attack." "The autopsy showed that his medication levels were inconsistent. The cardiologist explained that when patients skip doses or stop taking their medication intermittently, it can actually be more dangerous than not taking it at all." I wiped away tears that had started falling without my notice. "David was trying to follow your advice and my advice at the same time, and it killed him." The silence that followed was deafening. Dorothy sat frozen in her chair, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, she spoke in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "I was trying to help him." "You were trying to control him," I corrected. "Just like you accused me of doing. The difference is that I was trying to keep him alive, and you were convinced that you knew better than his doctors." Dorothy's face went through a series of expressions: denial, anger, and finally something that might have been the beginning of realization. "But you were always so involved in his medical care, always going to appointments with him, always asking about his pills." "Because I loved him and I was scared of losing him," I said, feeling the truth of it settle over me like a weight. "Because my husband had a serious heart condition, and I wanted to do everything I could to help him manage it. That's what people do when they love someone." I stood up again, needing to move, needing to process what I'd learned. The revelation was reframing everything I thought I knew about David's last months, about my own guilt, about Dorothy's accusations. But it was also raising new questions that made me feel cold all over. "Dorothy," I said slowly, turning back to face her. "There's something else I need to know. After David died, when you started telling people that I caused his heart attack, did you ever tell anyone about these phone calls you were making to him?" Dorothy's hands twisted in her lap, and for the first time since I'd walked into her house, she looked genuinely afraid. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that I was only beginning to understand. No, of course not, she said, but her voice wavered. Why would I tell people that? Because it would explain why you were so certain that I was responsible, I said, my mind racing. Dorothy, think about what you're telling me. You spent months convincing David to distrust his medication, to skip doses, to second-guess his doctors. And then when he died, you immediately started blaming me. That's not grief talking. That's guilt. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Don't you dare try to turn this around on me. You're the one who was controlling him, monitoring every pill, treating him like an invalid. I was trying to keep him alive. The words came out louder than I intended, echoing off the walls of her pristine living room. And you were systematically undermining everything his medical team was trying to do. Did it ever occur to you that maybe, just maybe, the cardiologist with 20 years of experience knew more about heart medication than you did? Dorothy stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her teacup. I raised that boy. I knew him better than anyone. I could see what all those pills were doing to him, how they were making him weak, dependent. They were keeping him alive, Dorothy. The autopsy proved it. The inconsistent medication levels, the pattern of skipped doses, the stress on his system from the irregular therapeutic levels, it all contributed to his death. I felt tears threatening again, but I pushed through them. And you knew. Some part of you had to know, because the minute he was gone, you started pointing fingers at everyone but yourself. The color had drained from Dorothy's face, but her jaw remained set in that stubborn line I'd seen so many times before. I was trying to help him be independent. You were babying him. I was supporting him through a chronic illness. There's a difference. I moved closer, studying her expression. Dorothy, I need you to be honest with me about something else. When you started telling people I caused David's heart attack, what exactly did you say? She looked away, focusing on a framed photo of David on the side table. I told them the truth, that you were always hovering, always controlling his medical care, always treating him like he was an invalid. But what specifically did you tell them about the day he died? Dorothy's silence stretched on so long, I wondered if she was going to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I told them that you had been arguing with him that morning about his pills. That he was stressed because you were always on him about taking his medication. Had we been arguing that morning? Another long pause. Not exactly arguing. What then? You had asked him if he'd taken his morning dose, and he said yes, but then you asked him again a few minutes later because you couldn't remember if he'd answered you. Dorothy's words came out in a rush, as if she were trying to get them over with. And he got a little frustrated and said something about how you were always checking up on him. I felt a chill run down my spine. That's not what you told people, though, is it? You made it sound like we'd had a big fight, like I'd been nagging him and causing him stress. Dorothy's shoulders sagged slightly, but she didn't answer. And the reason you focused on that tiny interaction, the reason you blew it up into something it wasn't, is because you needed there to be a reason that wasn't connected to all those phone calls you'd been making to him. I sat back down, feeling suddenly exhausted. Dorothy, don't you see what you did? You created a narrative that protected you from having to examine your own role in what happened. I didn't kill my son, she said, but there was less conviction in her voice than there had been before. I didn't say you did, but your interference with his medical care contributed to his death. And instead of dealing with that guilt, you decided to make me the villain. I leaned forward, trying to catch her eye. How many people did you tell this story to? How many people in our community think I'm responsible for my husband's death because you needed someone to blame? Dorothy finally looked at me, and I saw something crumble behind her eyes. I couldn't live with the possibility that my advice might have hurt him. I finished quietly. I understand that, Dorothy. I really do. The guilt has been eating me alive too. But the difference is that my guilt was over things I didn't do. Ways I thought I should have helped him more. Signs I thought I should have seen. Your guilt is over things you actually did. She buried her face in her hands, and for the first time since David's funeral, I saw her facade of righteous anger completely crumble. When she looked up, her eyes were red with tears. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, and she sounded like a lost child. "How am I supposed to live with this?" The question hung between us, and I realized that for the first time in our entire relationship, Dorothy was asking me for help instead of trying to tear me down. But I also knew that this conversation was far from over, and that the hardest part might still be ahead of us. I sat there looking at Dorothy's tear-streaked face, feeling the weight of her questions settle between us like a physical thing. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across her pristine living room, and I could hear the grandfather clock in her hallway ticking with metronomic persistence. Each tick seemed to emphasize the gravity of what we'd just uncovered together. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I honestly don't know how either of us is supposed to live with any of this." Dorothy reached for a tissue from the crystal holder on her coffee table, her hands shaking slightly. The same hands that had always been so steady, so sure when she was directing holiday dinners or organizing charity drives. Now they trembled as she dabbed at her eyes. "The things I said about you," she began, then stopped, pressing the tissue to her mouth as if she could push the words back in. "The way I made people think you were responsible. How do I take that back? How do I tell everyone I was wrong without admitting that I might have?" She couldn't finish the sentence. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same sensation I'd been carrying for months. "You start by telling the truth, just like you did with me, just now." "But it's not just me anymore," Dorothy said, her voice cracking. "It's Sarah, and Michael, and everyone at church, everyone in the neighborhood. They all think—" She gestured helplessly toward me. "They all think you're this terrible person who stressed their son to death, and I'm the grieving mother who lost her boy because of her awful daughter-in-law." The weight of it hit me anew. All those sideways glances at the grocery store, all those conversations that stopped when I walked into a room, all those invitations that had mysteriously stopped coming. I'd attributed it to people not knowing how to act around a widow, but now I understood it was something far more deliberate and damaging. "Dorothy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what exactly did you tell Sarah and Michael?" She closed her eyes, and I could see her steeling herself for another difficult admission. "I told them about that day, about the medication question, but I made it sound like you were constantly badgering him. I said you never let him have any peace, that you were always questioning his judgment about his health." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I told them that he'd confided in me about how exhausted he was from your constant worry and interference." I felt the blood drain from my face. Sarah and Michael, David's siblings who lived across the country but stayed in close contact with Dorothy. They would have told their spouses, their children. The story would have spread through David's extended family like ripples on a pond, each retelling probably making me sound worse. "And at church?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "I didn't say it directly," Dorothy said miserably. "But when people asked how I was doing, when they wanted to know what happened, I would get this look, and I'd say something about how hard it had been on David, having someone constantly questioning his decisions. People filled in the blanks themselves." I stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the energy that was suddenly coursing through me. I walked to her front window, looking out at the perfectly manicured street where I'd spent countless Christmas mornings, Easter dinners, and birthday celebrations. Where I'd been welcomed as family for over a decade, and where I now understood I'd been systematically destroyed in the eyes of people who had once cared about me. "Do you understand what you've done to my life?" I asked, not turning around. "It's not just that people think badly of me. I've lost my entire support system. I've been grieving my husband completely alone because everyone believes I killed him." I heard Dorothy's sharp intake of breath behind me. "I never meant for it to go that far." "But it did go that far," I said, finally turning back to face her. "And now we both have to figure out how to live in the aftermath." The room fell silent except for that relentless ticking clock. I found myself wondering how David would have handled this situation, what he would have said to his mother right now. He'd always been the buffer between us, the translator who could make each of us understand the other's perspective. Without him, we were like two people speaking different languages, fumbling toward understanding through a fog of grief and guilt. "There's something else," Dorothy said suddenly, her voice so quiet I almost missed it. I felt my stomach drop. "What?" She was looking down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger in a gesture that reminded me painfully of David when he was nervous. "The day before he died, when I called him about the medication, it wasn't the first time that week. I'd been calling him every day, sometimes twice a day, giving him different advice I'd read online or heard from friends. I sat back down heavily, feeling like the air had been knocked out of me. "Every day?" "I was so worried about him," she said, tears starting fresh. "His blood pressure had been high at his last appointment, and I kept reading these articles, and I had friends telling me about their husband's heart problems, and I couldn't stop myself from calling him with every new piece of information I found." The picture was becoming clearer and more horrible. "Dorothy, you were calling him at work?" "Yes, and at home in the evenings, and sometimes I'd text him articles during the day." She looked up at me with desperate eyes. "I thought I was helping. I thought I was being a good mother, looking out for his health." I tried to imagine what David's last week had been like, fielding constant calls from his anxious mother while trying to manage his demanding job and his health concerns. The stress of it must have been overwhelming. "The morning he died," Dorothy continued, "I called him before he left for work. I'd found an article about a new study on blood pressure medications, and I wanted to make sure he asked his doctor about it at his next appointment. He sounded tired, frustrated. He said he had to go, that he couldn't talk right then." My heart was pounding now, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "That was the last time you spoke to him?" Dorothy nodded, unable to speak. I thought about that morning, about David kissing me goodbye, about how distracted he'd seemed. I'd assumed he was thinking about the presentation he had to give that day, but now I wondered if he'd been thinking about his mother's phone call, about the mounting pressure he was feeling from all sides. Dorothy, I said carefully, when you told people about me supposedly nagging him, were you describing what I actually did, or were you describing what you did and putting it on me instead? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched as Dorothy's face went through a series of emotions: realization, horror, and finally, a kind of devastated understanding. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, God, what have I done?" Before I could respond, I heard a car door slam outside, followed by footsteps on Dorothy's front walkway. We both turned toward the sound, and my heart stopped when I recognized the voices approaching the front door. It was Sarah and Michael. David's siblings had come to town. Dorothy and I both froze as the familiar voices grew louder outside her front door. I recognized Sarah's laugh and Michael's deeper tone immediately. Of all the times for David's siblings to arrive in town, this moment felt like the worst possible timing. "I can't let them see me like this," Dorothy whispered frantically, wiping at her tear-stained face. "They don't know what I've been saying about you." The doorbell rang, followed by Sarah's cheerful voice calling out, "Mom, we saw your car in the driveway and there's another one too. Are you home?" I looked at Dorothy's panicked expression and made a quick decision. "We have to tell them the truth," I said quietly. "All of it. They deserve to know what really happened, and they deserve to hear it from us, not from someone else later." "I can't," Dorothy said, shaking her head. "They'll never forgive me. They'll think I killed their brother." "Dorothy, look at me," I said firmly. "You didn't kill David. But if we don't tell them now, if they find out later from someone else what you've been saying about me, it's going to be so much worse." Michael's voice joined Sarah's outside. "Mom, your neighbor said she saw you come home earlier. Is everything okay?" Dorothy looked toward the door, then back at me, her face filled with terror. "What if they hate me? What if I lose them too?" I reached over and took her hand. "They love you. They're going to be hurt and angry, but they love you. And right now, they think I'm the one who hurt David. That's not fair to any of us." The knocking grew more insistent. "Mom, we're getting worried," Sarah called out. "Please answer the door." Dorothy took a shaky breath and stood up. "Will you stay? Will you help me tell them?" I nodded, though my heart was racing. I had no idea how Sarah and Michael would react to learning that their mother had been spreading lies about me while simultaneously discovering that her well-intentioned but overwhelming concern might have contributed to their brother's stress levels. Dorothy walked slowly to the front door and opened it. Sarah and Michael stood on the porch, both looking concerned. Sarah was holding what looked like a casserole dish, and Michael had a small suitcase at his feet. "Mom, there you are," Sarah said, stepping forward to hug her mother. "We were starting to worry when you didn't answer right away." Then Sarah's eyes found me sitting in the living room, and her expression immediately changed. The warmth left her face, replaced by cool politeness. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." Michael followed his sister's gaze, and I saw his jaw tighten slightly when he saw me. "Hello," he said stiffly. The awkwardness in the room was suffocating. Here were David's siblings, people I'd once considered family, looking at me like I was an unwelcome stranger. And they had every reason to feel that way, based on what their mother had told them about me. "Please come in," Dorothy said, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk. All of us." Sarah stepped into the living room, still holding her casserole dish, while Michael followed behind her with visible reluctance. The tension was so thick, I could practically taste it. My stomach churned as I watched them both avoid making eye contact with me. "What's going on, Mom?" Sarah asked, setting the casserole on the coffee table. "You sounded upset on the phone earlier, and now—" She gestured vaguely in my direction, clearly uncomfortable. I could see Dorothy struggling with where to begin. Her hands were shaking as she sat back down beside me on the couch. Michael remained standing near the doorway, as if he wanted to be ready to leave at any moment. "There's something I need to tell you both," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you weeks ago." The silence stretched on. I found myself studying Sarah's face, remembering how she used to smile when she saw me, how she'd always been the first to call on holidays. Now she looked at me like I was a stranger who'd somehow infiltrated her family gathering. "Is this about David's funeral arrangements?" Michael asked stiffly. "Because if there's some kind of dispute about that, I think we can handle family business without involving—" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. "Michael, please," Dorothy said, and I heard years of guilt and regret in those two words. "Just sit down, both of you." Sarah perched on the edge of the armchair across from us, while Michael reluctantly took a seat on the opposite end of the couch. The physical distance felt symbolic of how far apart we'd all grown since David's death. "The thing is," Dorothy began, then stopped. She looked at me desperately, as if asking for permission, or maybe just support. I nodded encouragingly, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Go ahead, Dorothy. Tell them." "Tell us what?" Sarah's voice had an edge to it now. "Mom, you're scaring me." Dorothy took a shuddering breath. "I've been telling people that she caused David's heart attack." The words came out in a rush, like she had to force them out before she lost her nerve. "I've been saying it was her fault, that she stressed him out, that if she'd been a better wife, he'd still be alive." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Sarah's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, and then something that looked almost like relief. "But that's—" Sarah started, then stopped, looking between her mother and me. "That's what everyone's been saying. That's why we thought—" "That's why you both barely spoke to me at the funeral," I finished quietly. "That's why you've been avoiding my calls." Michael was staring at his mother with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mom, are you saying you made that up?" "No, Dorothy's voice cracked. "I believed it. I wanted someone to blame, and she was right there, and I was so angry and hurt, and I just—" "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, pressing her hands to her face. "Mom, what did you do?" The devastation in Sarah's voice cut through me. I could see her processing not just what Dorothy had done to me, but what it meant about everything they'd believed for the past month. "But wait," Michael said slowly. "If that's not what happened, then what did cause David's heart attack?" "The doctor said it was stress-related." This was the moment Dorothy had been dreading, and I could feel her entire body tense beside me. Now came the harder truth. Not just that she'd lied about me, but that she had to examine her own role in David's final weeks. "I think," Dorothy said, her voice breaking completely, "I think maybe I was the one who was stressing him out." The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. I watched Michael's face go pale while Sarah's hands slowly dropped from her face, revealing tears that had started to fall silently. "What do you mean?" Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. Dorothy's shoulders began to shake. The living room, with its carefully arranged family photos and the afternoon light streaming through the gauze curtains, suddenly felt too small to contain the enormity of what she was about to confess. I could see her struggling with each word, her fingers twisting the tissue until it began to shred. "I kept calling him," she said finally, Every day, sometimes twice a day, complaining about my health, about money, about how lonely I was. I'd guilt him into coming over to fix things that weren't really broken, just so I wouldn't be alone. Sarah sank back in the armchair as if the air had been knocked out of her. Mom! I knew he was working those extra shifts at the hospital, Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger but more pained. I knew he was exhausted, but I kept demanding more of his time. I'd call him at work with emergencies that weren't emergencies. I made him drive across town in traffic during his lunch breaks because I was convinced something was wrong with the furnace, or because I heard a noise in the attic. Michael was staring at his hands now, his jaw working like he was trying to process something too big to fit in his mind. The week before he died, you had him over there almost every night. I know. Dorothy's voice broke completely. I know he was tired. I could see it in his eyes, but I was so scared of being alone, so scared of getting older, that I convinced myself I needed him more than he needed rest. The silence stretched between us, filled only with the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower and Dorothy's quiet sobs. I found myself studying the family photos on the mantel, David at various ages, always smiling, always the peacemaker, the one everyone leaned on. Sarah finally spoke, her voice hollow. So when he had the heart attack, instead of facing that, you blamed her. It was easier, Dorothy whispered. It was so much easier to be angry at her than to look at what I'd done. And once I started saying it, once people started sympathizing with me and telling me how awful she must have been to him, I couldn't take it back. I watched Michael processing this, saw the exact moment when understanding hit him fully. His face crumpled slightly, and he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. God, Mom, do you have any idea what you've done? The question wasn't just about me, I realized. It was about all of us, about how Dorothy's lies had poisoned their grief, made them complicit in cruelty they never would have chosen if they'd known the truth. I know, Dorothy said, looking directly at me for the first time since she'd started talking. I know I can't take it back. I know I've ruined everything. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she looked at me, I saw David's eyes looking back. Kind, but weighted with a sadness that seemed too heavy for her young face. We believed it, she said simply. We believed every word, and we treated you like you were poison at Dad's funeral. We let you stand at that graveside thinking his own children blamed you for his death. The memory of that day rushed back, standing alone at the cemetery, while David's family clustered together on the other side of the casket, their faces cold and distant. I'd thought it was just grief, but now I understood it had been something much worse. You weren't the only ones, I said quietly. Half the hospital staff wouldn't even look at me. People I'd worked with for years crossed the street to avoid me. I thought I was losing my mind, wondering what I'd done wrong. Michael made a sound that was half groan, half sob. The whole family believes it. Aunt Ruth, Uncle Jim, all the cousins. They all think you killed our father with stress and neglect. The scope of Dorothy's lie was becoming clear, spreading out like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. It wasn't just about the three of them sitting in this room with me. It was about an entire extended family. An entire community that had accepted Dorothy's version of events as truth. I have to tell them, Dorothy said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. I have to tell everyone what I did. But even as she said it, I could see the fear in her eyes. Admitting she'd lied meant admitting why she'd lied, and that truth was almost harder to bear than the original grief.